Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for GLR on social media, on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. So once again, connect with us on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin momentarily. It will be recorded for you and shared afterwards.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Using Behavior Science to Help Families Help Kids. My name is Sarah Torian, and I'm a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and I'm helping to manage this online learning series. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a couple of really quick housekeeping details with you. First of all, I'd invite you to introduce yourself. Let us know your name, organization, and the name of the GLR coalition that you're a part of if you're a member of a GLR coalition, using the chat box on your Zoom screen. And please be sure to check to all panelists and attendees in the to part of the chat box so that everybody can see who's in the room with us today. Second, I wanted to share that all webinar attendees will be participating in listen-only mode during today's webinar, and that's to avoid any background noises or distractions that might happen during the presentations. But we do strongly encourage your active engagement throughout the webinar, and I would encourage you to share any thoughts or reflections that might come to you during the presentations using the chat box, or any questions that you'd like to share with our presenters using the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. And for those of you who've been joining in for these conversations for a while, this is a little bit new. Previously, we would post our questions in the chat box. We now have access to a Q&A box, so look for that. Share your questions there. It makes it much easier for us to track them and make sure that none get buried, and we can share them with our presenters. And then finally, I also wanted to give you a heads up that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to all who registered for the webinar in an email that will go out early next week, which will also include a link to the slide deck as well as any resources that are shared during today's conversation. So keep an eye out for that and share it with your colleagues or watch the materials again. Finally, I wanted to give you a heads up that we will be posting a very brief survey poll after the presentations and during the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I'd strongly encourage you to take just a couple of quick moments to share your thoughts and feedback. In that, it really helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement, making sure these conversations are relevant for your work and meeting your needs. Now I'd like to share just a little bit of background about the GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got a number of great sessions planned for the coming weeks. Always on Tuesdays, other than the special webinar we had earlier today and some other special webinars that might be coming up soon, but we'll keep you posted on those, but always on Tuesdays. In particular, I'd like to point out that next week's conversation about family engagement, the Family Engagement Consortium, will probably be of interest to a lot of those of you who are joining in for today's conversation, as it will be exploring how 19 states have engaged in a collaborative process to develop and begin implementing statewide family engagement frameworks that extend from birth all the way through high school graduation. So I hope you'll make plans to join in for that one as well. We have now hosted nearly 30 webinars since the launch of GLR Learning Tuesdays last September, so I would also encourage you to check out CLIP. That's the campaign's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, where you can find the growing archive of resources from these conversations, including all of the webinar recordings, slide decks, and related resources, exploring the best science, ideas, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. And then I hope you'll continue to save this date and time and make plans to join in for more of these online learning conversations. One more quick update before we begin today's conversation. Just a reminder that we did make the decision, the campaign, to transition GLR Week 2020 to a virtual event, but we do still plan to offer an incredibly robust and rich agenda with multiple learning and sharing opportunities each day throughout that week. So I hope that you are still continuing to hold July 13th through 17th for GLR Week 2020. Keep an eye out. We'll be sharing some more information about that agenda and how you can register for different events in the coming weeks. But now for today's conversation. We've long embraced the mantra that parents are a child's first and most important teacher, and that's true today in ways that many of us never even imagined, I'm sure, as schools and child care centers remain closed for weeks, and more states are announcing that they won't open schools again this school year. This current situation, this new normal that I think many of us are kind of struggling to wrap our heads around, underscores the critical need to strengthen supports for parents and elevate parent success as a big bet for philanthropy, public policy, and programs. And I think that behavior science can inform those efforts. And so exploring how it can is exactly the topic of today's conversation. And to begin that conversation, I am incredibly honored to introduce Helen Westmoreland, who will be our moderator for today's conversation. Helen is the director of the National Parent-Teacher Association's Center for Family Engagement, where she leads the PTO's efforts to empower parent leaders to be champions for transformative family engagement. Previously, she was the deputy director at Flamboyant Foundation, where she co-developed their family engagement strategy, and before that, she worked with the Harvard Family Research Project. So welcome, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us for today, and thanks so much for helping to plan this robust conversation.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to you and Yoli and Ralph and the entire Campaign for Grade Level Reading team for hosting these great conversations and inviting me to help be a part of this today. I'm really excited about the awesome lineup for all of you listening in today that you're going to get. I'm going to take just a little bit of time to frame some of the conversation at the beginning and hopefully help connect the dots to what in the world behavior science might have to do with your work in your communities. So first, as Sarah mentioned, I want to just talk a little bit about why now this is more important perhaps than ever before. So with the pandemic happening, we are needing to be in touch with families in a very urgent way. And if our homeschool communication systems aren't working, we're leaving families in the dark. As one of our great panelists today, Todd Rogers, said so eloquently in an Ed Week op-ed just a couple weeks ago. So at the same time, we know that many schools, districts, and communities are really trying to get creative about how they can meet families' and students' needs, whether that's around mental health, around food distribution, around distance learning. All of these great ideas, however, need to reach families, as in families need to be able to know that those solutions exist, give feedback on how they're working, and support their kids to do them. So if our homeschool communications aren't designed with those sort of end actors in mind, then we're going to be spinning our wheels where a lot of without as much success. So why focus on behavior science at all, and what does behavior science really mean for us? So behavior science and homeschool communication are linked in a couple of important ways. So when you think of your family school communication system, in this little arrow here, you might think of all your online portals, your websites, your texting, the emails, the letters you get, the letters you send home, report cards, all these sort of systems. And what behavior science really does is drill deep into those and say, what does it take for these systems to change behavior? And there's one important thing I want to point out here. Good homeschool communication, as everyone knows on this line, is two-way, right? So it is both what schools and districts are sharing with families, but also with what families are sharing back with our staff and our educators in schools about what's going on in their house, what they want for their children. a lot of the research and a lot of our efforts now, I just want to acknowledge, are unidirectional, right? They're trying to reach families. And a lot of behavior science does that too. So I just want to acknowledge that sort of two-way piece is important. We're going to be focusing a lot on sort of the responsibility of folks who work inside the education system to be reaching out to families and what they can do and learn from behavior science to do that. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. And so to contextualize a little bit about when we say change behavior, what does that really mean for us in order for our homeschool communication systems to work? I think sometimes there are a lot of assumptions baked in to a very simple email you might send your families about what they're going to do with that information. So it might be something simple like, you know, return this letter home. It might be something very, very complex. So what we wanted to do is just give you all as participants a moment to connect with one another in the chat box about when you think of the homeschool communication systems in your community, what are some of the behaviors that are implied in their design? What are you asking families to do through your homeschool communication system? Why don't we just take a couple of minutes if you all could share a few of your thoughts there. Awesome. So we're getting some good things coming in about assumptions, staying up to date with things, returning homework. That's a big one. Asking families maybe to talk at home with their kids about something, maybe asking families to read with their kids. You can see in this little fun diagram. Maybe you're asking families about some home routines. Maybe you're asking them to celebrate. Maybe you're asking them to do something specific with folks inside the school, whether that's attend a meeting, come to a conference, brainstorm a solution, right? So there's a lot of things that are implied in our homeschool communication systems. And what I love about this topic, and I'm excited to turn it over to our panelists to talk about, is how we can really be specific about what we're asking and use the science of behavior change to make sure we're leading to that change. We're going to focus a good bit on our conversation around some of the real benefits in the world of attendance, right? So how do we help families, help kids attend school, not be late to school, right? So think about some of those asks that you might have in your community. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our incredible panelists. We have three great folks here with us today. Todd Rogers will be our first panelist. Todd is a behavioral scientist and professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. His work applies behavioral science insights and methods to understand important social challenges and to develop interventions to mitigate against those challenges, including several that are of interest to the GLR network, such as increasing student attendance and homework completion. He co-founded In Class Today, a social enterprise focused on helping districts reduce student absenteeism. At Harvard, he is a director at the Student Social Support R&D Lab. After Todd speaks, we're going to hear a little bit of on the ground how some of this work is applied from the incredible Hedy Chang, who's the executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student attendance by addressing chronic absenteeism. She has spent more than 2 decades working in the fields of family support, family economic success, education, and child development. In 2013, she was named by the White House as a champion for change for her commitment to furthering African American education. Thank you also for joining us, Hedy. And then lastly, we have got an incredible school leader to talk about what we might be able to do with all this great information. Angela Madigan is the principal of Waterboro Elementary School, located in a rural community in southern Maine. In her recent experience as a school leader, she was the recipient of the 2018 Socio-Emotional Learning Innovation Award, Eco-Maine Excellence Award, and was awarded several grants and recognitions for the school's efforts in employing social and emotional learning initiatives, sustainability efforts, and health and wellness projects. She has maintained a partnership with Count Maine In and works diligently with families to reduce barriers and make access to learning more equitable for all students. So thank you all three for joining us. I'm going to start with Todd Rogers, who's going to kick us off today. Todd, could you help us understand a little more about what behavior change research has been shown to help families help kids?
Sure. Thanks, Helen. Helen, could you put a thumb up if you can hear my voice? All right, good. Thanks. It is a real privilege to be on this this panel with Hedy and Angela and Helen. First, I appreciate Helen's introduction, underscoring that family engagement can be, should be two-way. And a lot of the examples we'll talk about are one way, but you'll see how they apply to all communications. I want a brief overview. A way to think about what behavioral science is it's the study of how people actually think and actually behave, full stop. And so it's actually the study of how people think and behave, and often that is inconsistent with what we might think. I'll start with an example. One of the most powerful behavioral insights is how people respond to what they think other people are doing. I am not sophisticated with this Zoom platform. Oh, am I sharing my slide yet? Can you see my slide, Helen? Yes, you can. Good. So I'm not sophisticated with it, but I'm going to ask you to vote. And I guess if you want to vote in the box, you can, but otherwise you can just vote to yourselves. Which do you think would be more motivating? Telling people voter turnout is low, your vote really counts, please vote, or telling them that voter turnout is high, you should vote too. So I don't know if there's a way to vote online, but basically take a guess. I will tell you that I did a survey of self-reported experts in voter mobilization, and they were split 50-50 on which they thought would be more motivating, saying the turnout's going to be high or saying the turnout's going to be low. And we ran a randomized controlled experiment where we randomly assigned voters to a group that got high turnout or a group that got low turnout messaging, and we look at how it actually affects motivation to vote. So now that you voted, it turns out people are much more motivated to vote when they think lots of other people are voting. Even though their vote matters less, they're less likely to be pivotal, they know lines will be longer. We tend to conform to the behavior of others. That's like the first principle. I'll show it applied to education and absenteeism in a second. But this is information that when we don't know what normal is, it causes us anxiety, and we look around to see what other people are doing, which is perfectly sensible. I ran a survey last night with my lab at Harvard, the Student Social Support R&D lab, and we found that 85% of parents of kids in K-12 right now want to know whether the amount of work their kid is doing is normal, above or below what everyone else is doing. They have absolutely no frame of reference, and it's causing parents a lot of anxiety, not knowing what normal is. Because I have two small kids, and I added this question because I wanted to know what normal was. And I have, so the idea would be if a family is doing less than what everyone else is doing, they might be, it might actually motivate them. The prediction would be that it would motivate them to engage a little more. But on the opposite hand, if a family is doing more than everybody else, letting them know that might get them to decrease their engagement. We tend to conform to what we think the behavior of others is. So when my kids go to high school here, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they'll go to Cambridge Rindge and Latin, which is the single public high school for the district. And sitting at the bus stop of the school last year was this public service announcement. 7,000 high school students drop out every school day. So what this says to high school kids is that lots of kids are dropping out. It normalizes dropping out. It resembles a study that a mentor and collaborator of mine, Bob Cialdini, ran in the Arizona Petrified Forest, where the National Park Service put a sign up saying, every year 4 tons is stolen from the forest floor of petrified wood. Please don't steal petrified wood. And with their permission, they ran an experiment where they put petrified wood around the sign and they varied the sign every day. And they found that don't steal petrified wood, adding every year 4 tons is stolen, increased stealing. It licensed people to take more because they knew lots of people were doing it. So this message basically says to high school kids sitting at the bus stop, lots of kids are dropping out of high school. You should too. or you can. Many of you probably get a mailing comparing each month or every quarter, comparing your energy use to your neighbors. It says you use more energy than your neighbors use less. That is similarly based on our research project that Bob Cialdini and others did, where they found that people who realize they use more energy than everybody else decrease their energy use pretty substantially. So now it gets implemented around the country. 1 in 4 US households gets it. It's the most effective way to reduce energy use anyone has ever discovered. And they discovered this by randomized control trials. So a treatment group gets it, a control group doesn't, and then they look at energy use and they send it on a monthly or quarterly basis. The least inspired research project I have ever done actually has ended up being the most impactful, was doing that exact intervention for student absenteeism. And this was inspired. I turned on student absenteeism because I had a conversation with Hedy about 10 years ago, completely changed the trajectory of my research and my interests. I'm sure there's almost 500 people on the call, probably 300 of them have changed their work in some like dramatic way because of Hedy. At least I've just base rates. So when we started doing that exact intervention, we realized in surveys that the majority of parents underestimate, or the majority of parents of kids who miss a lot of school. So if my kid misses 20 days, the majority of parents think their kid misses less than their classmates. The majority of parents think their kid misses less than their classmates, even when their kid misses more than their classmates. So they have this false belief. And they also underestimate their own kids' absences by 50%. My kid has missed 20 days. I think my kid has missed 10. So what we find is writing in a 4th grade reading level to make it super easy to understand, pilot testing every part, sending these things monthly. We reduce chronic absenteeism by 10 to 15%. We've replicated it in 15 randomized experiments from district-wide in Philly and LA and lots of districts along the way, including Chicago and others. And so I ended up starting an organization out of my lab that we spun out. It's a separate organization called Everyday Labs, which I know works with many of the districts that are logged on right now, implementing this around the country. And the idea is it's a light touch intervention that captures the easy days to free up resources to go after the harder stuff. It's about 1/50th to 1/100th the cost per net day generated of things like mentors or any other kind of intervention. I also want to put one last thing because we're going to get to it later. It's mail. It's based on hard copy mail. And the reason is because digital communications, we have found, these personalized automated digital communications have trivial or no effect on absenteeism, whereas the hard copy sticks around. People put it on the fridge, they put it on the kitchen counter. It becomes, and we'll revisit this later when we talk about communication, it becomes what we call a social artifact in the home. When a behavior is going to unfold over time, we want to make sure that the communication we're sending them somehow has a shelf life in the home. And the last point I want to make on this is we've now run in this organization dozens of randomized experiments and A/B testing to figure out how to make it more effective. So we figured out the optimal timing, the optimal messaging, the optimal targeting by grade. It works consistently K through 12, though we modify the message at different grade levels, 5 or 6 rounds a year. But the point, before I wrap up on this, is that this is what that you districts and districts should be expecting of its vendors. This is a different hat. This is not my Harvard hat. This is a separate organization. But it keeps evaluating itself with randomized experiments and control groups, and it keeps doing A/B testing to optimize. So it's getting better. The treatment effect is about 50% more than it was a year and a half ago, and it keeps getting better because it has scale. And I think districts should come to expect this of their vendors, and this kind of testing. So, for example, Hedy and I were talking yesterday about a study we just did on this, where we're trying to help districts collect contact information for their most vulnerable families. Basically, as you guys have probably started to learn, about half of the bottom third of families we don't have valid digital contact information for. Their cell phones are no longer valid, their email addresses aren't checked. So we can't digitally contact a very large chunk of the most vulnerable families. So Everyday Labs and I am, and my Harvard hat, lots of us are trying to figure out how do we get this digital contact information. And an idea that we've been really worried about is getting undocumented families to, families that have students in the district but have undocumented people in their homes, how to get them to trust enough to share their contact information with the district, because we hear that that is one of the barriers to sharing this contact information, is a fear about what will happen with this contact information. And so we ran an experiment online where we recruited a few hundred families, and we gave half of them a message: please share your contact information with your district. Would you share it? The other half, we said same message. Plus we said, we promise we'll keep your data secure and will not share it with other people. And it turned out in this online experiment that prompting, that saying you will not share the contact information with other people decreased people's likelihood of giving their contact information to you. That ironically, making it salient that there are privacy risks made people less likely to share it with you than not making it salient, even though you're assuring them you're not going to share it. And I've since dove in the last 24 hours in lots of literature. Turns out that is a common phenomenon across lots of domains. Without doing this kind of A/B testing, we wouldn't have known that. But this is 2 points before I pass it back to you, Helen. The first.
No, that's incredible, Todd. I want to thank you, because I think 2 key takeaways. You talked about normalizing behavior and then sort of the framing effects, right? So like you might think that you're mitigating something by saying, and don't worry about X, Y, Z, but in fact, you're putting it front and center of people's minds. What else can you tell us that the behavior science shows that we might be doing inadvertently, making things harder to have an impact on families and kids?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking. Here's the other thing that I just want to drive home, which is the second powerful behavior change principle. The first was we tend to conform to the behavior of others, and we badly want to know what normal is. And it causes anxiety to not know. And in the process, I illustrated we should be testing everything. And it turns out sometimes it's really easy to test. We just don't hold high enough expectations for testing of our vendors and our partners. The second one is simplification. Every district on here, if we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you have a parent portal where parents can log in and get access to LMS information. Everyone would raise their hand. And then I ask you to keep your hand raised if the majority of parents use it on a regular basis, and no one would keep their hand up. But this is an example of what was a typical portal. It requires a student ID number to log in and an account creation code, which your school will supply. You can also open it by visiting your school, but you'll need a photo ID like a license or a passport just to log in. It's an incredibly high friction way to share this information with families. And what I'm going to soon illustrate is how simplifying, reducing friction, making things easier makes people much more likely to do them. Maybe sounds obvious, but let me show you an example. Peter Bergman, a collaborator of mine, did this really nice study that was in LA Unified, where he used the learning management system where all teachers use the same grade book, which is not a common thing. All teachers use the same grade book, and they keep it up to date. All teachers use the same grade book, and they keep it up to date. And what he does is he automatically pushes out to parents by text actionable things. Whereas with the attendance stuff, missing school unfolds over weeks and days. This is at 6 p.m. you find out your kid did not turn in their homework today, or your kid cut class today, or your kid's grade fell below passing. These are things that call for immediate actions. And what he found was that it increased GPA, it reduced course failure, and it increased standardized test scores. I've since replicated this intervention in the United Kingdom with the Prime Minister's office, which we collaborate with. He and I replicated it in Washington, D.C. public schools. He then replicated it in Morgantown, West Virginia, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. Super powerful. But what we're going to illustrate here in a project with Jessica Lasky-Fink and Peter, in D.C. with 7,000 kids, 7,000 parents of middle and high school kids, we randomly assigned them to get a message after we inform them that we're going to offer this service. The first, we say we're going to offer the service, but in order to get it, you need to log in at the website. But in order to log in, you need to call your school to log in. This is the standard way an offering like this is offered. I would ask you in person to write down, actually everybody now, write down or in your head, come up with what percent of parents, about average schools for the DC public school system, 12 middle and high schools, 7,000 parents. What percent of parents end up enrolling in this program, okay? And then I would ask you right now, and actually Helen, I'll ask you, this is a lot of friction. They need to call the school to start this program. How would you simplify it? How could you make it easier for them to enroll? I'm sorry for putting you on the spot there, Helen.
You could send them their info as part of the text.
Right.
One thing.
Good. Okay. And Helen and I have not prepped for this, so I totally jammed you there. Sorry.
I love it.
So what she suggested was basically reduce the friction, make it so they don't have to call the school. A version of what she proposed is say text start to enroll. Okay. So all we do is they still have to actively enroll, but in one hand we just reduce the friction. Now just text start instead of calling your school. And now I'm not going to do it. I feel bad for having done it last time, Helen. But I'm going to do it.
I know this one though. I know.
Okay. Now what's the easy? Now how would you do? What would you do to maximize the percent of parents who engage in this program?
You tell them everybody's enrolled and you can opt out.
Boom. Okay. Good. No prep at all. So the last condition is you're automatically enrolled. Text stop to opt out. So I want everybody to predict. Everybody should predict what they think enrollment would be across conditions. And now I'll show you. In the standard opt-in, less than 1% of parents enroll. That if you're a district leader, you're not wrong to think this is a valueless, useless technology. Next condition. Now all we did was we just changed it from call your school to text start. 11% of parents enroll. Now you may think that's not a lot. It's more than 1,000% or 10x increase in enrollment just by reducing friction. So that's not trivial. Although you're probably also guessing, these are the parents of the highest performing kids. So they're not the kids that we're most concerned about, although it's great to keep them informed. In this last condition now, by changing the default, now if you do nothing, you're automatically enrolled. We had 95% of parents enrolled. And what we find is, like in every other replication of this, GPA goes up in this condition. 1 in 4 kids doesn't fail a class they would have failed otherwise. And my favorite part, and this is totally aligned with the powerful partnerships idea here, we do a survey of all parents during the summer, and we find that parents in the opt-out condition who have been getting a ton more useful information from their schools than anyone has ever been getting at these schools, they are more likely than the control to say, I want more information than I've been getting. They've already been getting a ton and they want still more, which is to say that parents don't know what they don't know. And when they get useful information, they act on it, they improve student achievement, and they want more. I just want to illustrate other applications of this. So simplifying the opt-in. We'll talk about another example of this that Hedy and I collaborated on later. Opt-out. My home district here, the superintendent and I were talking about how to get all kindergartners to get library cards. When my kid was in kindergarten, the teacher pestered us until we filled out a form. They try, every time we came in or anyone engaged with the school, they try to get kindergartners to get library cards. That was one of the initiatives. 43% of kindergartners got library cards by the end of the year, which is pretty good. It's hard to get parents to fill out forms, especially given all the stuff that we're asking parents to do. I suggested, how about if you make it so that every kid is automatically getting a library card unless they specifically ask to not get one? And now ethically, you have to make sure that families know that this is happening. So instead of teachers getting us to fill out the form, teachers made sure that we knew that it was going to happen. And then the following year, they had 95% of families have library cards. It's actually 96% of families got library cards, up from 43% by shifting the default. I'm going to show one other version of simplification, and then I will pass it to you, Helen. Nearly every school district has some version of a notice of truancy that is required to be sent home when a kid misses 3 days or is late 3 days from school. This was the state standard in California. I'll read the first sentence. California Education Code section 48260 provides that a pupil child subject to compulsory full-time education. It's written at a college reading level. It's written as if it's not written for humans at all. It's like written only for lawyers. It has 350 some words in 7-point font, and it's a pretty punitive language. So working with Hedy, Carly Robinson, and again, Jessica Lasky-Fink, and then with Kamala Harris when she was the Attorney General before she was a senator, we got permission to simplify the form. And we wrote a new letter that was written at a 5th grade reading level, much more of a team collaborative tone. We need your help. We compressed the state mandated language to 4-point font down here at the bottom. This is written at a 5th grade reading level. And then with a school district in California that has hundreds of thousands of students, we randomly assigned which families got which form. And then we looked at what happened to their attendance afterwards. And we found, so again, this is an easy randomized experiment. So there's 150,000 families in this experiment. It's costless because they already have to send these things. And when scaled up, it's used, millions of these get sent out every year around the country, let alone in California. And we found that the improved letter increased the impact of this letter in reducing absenteeism. It was about 40% more effective than the standard notice of truancy. So now this school district that we worked with is making the improved version, the state standard, and working with David Coprud and the California State SARB, we're trying to find a way to make this improved letter the state standard in California. And lots of other districts around the country have implemented it. The gist of this is communicating in the clearest, easiest, most accessible way. It's like you're all educators writing as if you intend to be understood. It's a form of simplification. We talked about shifting the default from your automatically in to your automatically out with the enrolling in the texting program. And then just simplification, reducing friction, going from call your school to get the code to log in to instead just text start. And then here's another form of simplification, which is just writing clearly. And now I pass to Helen.
Thank you, Todd. I'm sort of buzzing with questions in my own mind and seeing a few coming in here on the Q&A box. So I just want to remind folks listening to please, if you've got questions, ask them in the Q&A box. It's a little hard to track them in the chat box, and we want to be sure we get to them. And you're getting us thinking about a lot here, Todd. I heard you talk about the importance of simplification as sort of a second big takeaway of behavior science. Could you elaborate on that? You gave us a little preview when you were talking about just with all of the COVID communications that are happening right now, what advice would you offer to schools and districts about how to make people read those COVID emails?
Got it.
Or letters.
Hedy is next, and Hedy was a co-author on this and helped to really make this project here happen. We will send out and we'll share through Helen and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading a user accessible version of this for if they want to modify their notice of truancy when we get back, when we will someday get back to a school in a normal way. I don't know when that will be. But with regards to COVID communication, I wrote a column a few weeks ago called Why No One is Reading Your Coronavirus Emails. And it was based on these same principles. One, parents are more important than ever. Parents have always been extraordinarily central, whether they're treated that way or not, to students' learning. But now no learning happens but for parents creating space and making sure that the conditions for positive learning environment are created. So parents are more important than ever. And some principles are people have limited attention, extremely limited attention, extremely limited time, and varying levels of ability to read and accessibility of written words. So given those as premises, I should also, we did a survey in my lab again, and the majority of people are reading the content that's being sent to them from their school districts by their phone, on their phones. Maybe not surprising to you and I, but and we have not done a survey of teachers yet, but it's clear from what I get from my kids' school that given the tables that are sent and the formatting, that these messages that I'm getting from the schools are not written realizing that we're all reading from the phone. So people have limited attention, people have limited time, and different reading levels. The more challenging the reading level, the less accessible it will be. So some principles, write with as few words as possible. Blaise Pascal famously said, "I would have written you a shorter note if I'd had more time." It is often misattributed to Mark Twain. It sounds like the kind of thing Mark Twain would say, but I'll repeat it. "I would have written you a shorter letter if I'd had more time." It's hard to write concisely, but it's easier to read concise writing. Write in the most accessible reading level possible. A lot of the most vulnerable families are either English as second language or have limited reading accessibility. No matter, and even college graduates who are very literate have a hard time making time to read long written prose. I am at an institution that does a lot of writing, and my friends and I forward along, well, all right, I already started it. Forward along some of the emails that get sent to us from our leaders that are literally like, they're beautiful, beautiful prose that I will read someday in the future when I have time. Write in a way that's easy to skim, knowing that people have limited time and limited attention. The communications should have concrete actions. Whatever your call to action is, whatever you're asking someone to do, it should be easy for a skimmer to figure that out. And we should think about it being timely, delivered in a time when it can be acted on. All formatting should reinforce whatever the goal of the message is. There's no point in superfluous formatting. It should reinforce the message, especially given that people don't have time and have limited attention and limited accessibility. And some new things to think about now that we are in many states, and almost certainly in most states, we have 2 more months of this with regards to school. We know that it's a program of communication with families and not one-off communications. So given that, it's worth chunking the messages, thinking of these as programmatic sequences of communications rather than one-offs. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this, some organizations are doing a really good job of managing our expectations by building routines of, in the morning by 8 a.m. you will receive this, or every Monday you will receive a plan for the week. But just managing expectations and thinking about communications programmatically instead of one-off, also through the lens that people have limited time, limited attention. And the final one is, the modality should serve the message's purpose. If it is an update or a long list of things, you can imagine an email is better than a text, because if it doesn't require timely action, it can be postponed until the future to be read when someone has time. But it has the danger that it's going to be buried beneath the hundreds of other emails people are getting. We talked earlier about mail, and basically forget how it's delivered. Hard copy also has an important place. If you want something to bridge time, that's the language we use in behavioral science about interventions that happen now that are trying to change behavior in the future. How do you bridge time? One way is to have some physical artifact left behind. And I know right now it's particularly difficult to mail things, but now that we're thinking programmatically about long periods of time, it's worth thinking about the modality of communication should match the objective of the communication. And knowing that digital things disappear after they've been consumed. But also text is awesome. Text is great if it's a timely reminder that can be acted on the moment it's received. But after that, as we just introspect about your experience with these different modalities, they each serve a different purpose. And same with Google Classroom is fantastic for contacting kids exactly in the moment when they're doing their educational work. but if you're not asking them to do something immediately and you're asking them to do something way in the future, it's going to get lost in the feed. So the whole point is people have limited attention, limited time. We should be developing programs of communication that are as few words as possible, as accessible as possible, skimmable, and have concrete actions. And it's programmatic. And these are some of the takeaways on the way I've been thinking, Helen, about how we use behavioral science, how people actually think and behave with regards to how we're communicating with families right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Todd, for sharing all that. Remind folks to keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. Sarah has helpfully been putting some of the links to the resources and studies that we've been talking about in the chat box. Those will also go out, and the registration email that'll go out at the end of this webinar for everybody to be able to get. Next, I am really pleased to introduce awesome Hedy Chang from Attendance Works, who's done some incredible work around the country, and especially for this GLR community. Hedy, why don't you kick us off with telling us a little bit about how Attendance Works has been lifting up and applying some of the behavior science Todd has been sharing with us in your work with state and local leaders to help them strengthen their connections with families.
Sure, and I'm going to be pretty quick on this part, and then when we get to talking about COVID, which is the next one, I'll do a little longer. But, you know, essentially a lot of what Todd's work has been about tier 1 interventions. How do we positively message? How do we support families? How do we help make sure, you know, so the nudge letters are part of tier 1 interventions. The way you talk simply to families about why attendance matters. You can do that in a way that is about your tier 1 or interventions. And that's one of the ways that we've really incorporated his work in the kind of strategies we use. I also want to say that I think as people think about the modes of communication, you may need to think also, in addition to what Todd's talking about in terms of different modes have different kind of lasting impact, but different families may have access to different modes of communication. So while I think texting probably works with the vast majority of families, particularly families who are struggling with homelessness, who might be at tier 3, we've heard sometimes that it's actually email that's better. There's a real challenge for low-income families having telephones, having you know, phone plans at work, and that's actually coming up as a real issue now, but it's an issue in general. So thinking hard about what kinds of communications can reach different kinds of families, what modes are needed, but the importance of having short, simple, you know, sort of Todd's last comments about how we want to frame messages are always going to be important. Next slide, please. When we've used this, we've taken this research, and this is an example of work they did in Connecticut, where they were really trying to think about how would you go from lower to higher impact family engagement. And this is actually a chart they did where they talked about strategies for reaching families. And in particular, we were able to think about, and I actually consulted with Todd's team to talk about, to make sure that when we gave guidance back to Connecticut, that what they talked about as the higher impact student learning opportunities, the personalized communication to families about how many absences happened, actually incorporated his comments. Next slide. And what we really think is that as you think about these key ingredients of systemic change, you can sort of think about what are these effective strategies for communication? How do we build capacity among our teachers, among our staff, and in our systems, so we can always have this positive engagement using few words, but real actionable data to help motivate daily attendance. So that's kind of what we've been doing in the general world of attendance. And that is still going to be a little bit applicable to pre-COVID, but I think as we've gotten into school closures, we've had to really rethink some of the ways we do this too.
That's a good segue. So Hedy, could you talk a little bit about that? So in the COVID sort of era, how are you thinking about some of this behavior science being applied to some of your work around chronic absenteeism in terms of how schools and teachers especially connect with families? Because I know I have heard folks are really worried about the group of students that they're not seeing in their remote learning, and they're not logging on, and there's some real parallels with all the work you do during the school year when we're, you know, quote unquote normal. How are you thinking about this related to your work during the pandemic?
Yeah, so if we can take a look at these phases of COVID response. And I want to talk about this in two ways. First of all, this notion of the needing to compartmentalize, I think is really important. We are all so overwhelmed by what is happening to us. And one of the things that I find that is helpful both for messaging, but also thinking about how to take action is actually to almost compartmentalize the work and think about what are the different phases. So we've been in this decide to close school phase. And then we've now been in this outreach after school closure, which has a whole set of work and communications that you need to engage with families. And we're now well into support and engagement during remote learning while schools are closed. How do we keep making sure kids are learning and they're not completely losing out on learning time? And then at some point to be determined, we're going to transition back to school, whether that is in-person school, you know, bricks and mortar school, or that's virtual school. But what I think is important is we want to forward think about the calendar, the whole set of work, because what you do now in these early phases is going to affect a lot what happens in the later phases. So for example, right now, as people have been doing outreach for school closure, you really want to make sure that you're connecting with families in a positive, warm, welcoming way, so that they're going to want to talk to you during this whole time where schools are closed, and we want to support and engage families. I also will say that what's happened under COVID has revealed, as Todd's op-ed showed, a huge problem, which is we don't update our contact information for families very often. And it has really caught us off guard. You know, I've talked to districts, they can't find 20–30% of their kids and families. And part of that is because we don't have ongoing good contact information. And I think one of the things that we're learning is that we're going to have to collect multiple forms, not just address, but email, but also your text numbers. And then you're going to have to update that on an ongoing way, because if we can't find our families, we can't communicate anything with them. And we might have to think about even other creative ways to get them to communicate with us. And this means we're going to have to agree upon some pretty key, simple messages to get out to families. One message I think about, for example, that we should be thinking about is exclaiming to every family that you have a right to an education. So even, for example, if you've moved out of district to your grandmother's house because that's where you think your kids will be safe, you still have a right to an education. And that could mean that you keep the same contact with your kid's prior teacher. We need to be thinking about the kinds of messages that we send in each of these phases and understand what's the most important message that we want to send to families, what's the most important actions we want to take, and what are the most important questions we need to find out from them so we can support our kids and families. And frankly, a lot of messages right now are about food and shelter, but they can also be about making sure kids feel safe and connected. And if we could look at these positive conditions of learning, this is something that we've been thinking about. So the next slide, please. This is something we created prior to COVID. And what we felt was that when kids show up to school, it's when they feel physically, emotionally healthy and safe, when they feel a sense of the belonging, connection, and support, when they fail academic challenge and engagement, and when the adults and students have the emotional competence to support that. And this is really important for both kids and their families. This still holds true when we're talking about virtual learning settings. And I think the opportunity and the challenge for us under COVID-19 is to make sure all kids experience this and to use our data. For example, looking at who was chronically absent before COVID, who is not responding to a daily outreach to their families, to figure out who needs extra support, to make sure that all of these conditions are in place. And we ought to also start to put in place, even with virtual and remote learning, ways that we reach out to families every day. And just as we did with chronic absence, come up with triggers for when we have to take more action and enlist more support to connect with families. So if a student doesn't respond 2 days in a row, if you've never reached out to a family, what's our set of sort of tiered supports to support families? And what's our quick key messages that we can send out to families to make sure they know we care about them and they know we're there to support them?
Thank you so much, Hedy, for really grounding us in some of how we can apply this to our work with families and students and the parent-teacher partnership more broadly. Next, I'm really honored to introduce the network on the line here to Angela Madigan, our incredible principal from the Count Me In initiative in Maine. Angela, I want to just start a bridge to Q&A with you to hear a little bit about your reflections. Because I understand, I tell everyone on the line, Angela and I talked earlier this week or last week, and the work you have done to move parent-teacher partnerships in your school building is really incredible. Could you talk a little bit about some of what you heard today and what resonated and sort of made you go, oh, there's some science behind what I was doing? And what are you thinking about next of like, oh, maybe I could do this to further my parent-teacher partnership even more?
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. It's actually interesting. I want to make sure that everyone knows this was certainly not just me. This was a team of people who worked on this together. This was a shared project. The Count Me In initiative and Susan Lieberman was definitely a huge part of this project, as well as our outreach services coordinator and our counselors we have here at the school. So this was certainly a team effort. So if I say I definitely mean we. And it's interesting, I'm kind of seeing this in two worlds. The way that we as a team led our staff through this process and communicated with our staff touched on a lot of these areas that Todd and the team have talked about. Conforming to others being definitely one that we used with our staff. That's great. We've had, 80% of our staff have reached out with a positive message to their families. If you need support in this, let us know. We'd be happy to partner you. So we use that conforming to others to work with our own staff. Simplification when staff were unsure about what a positive connection or phone call might look like. We created a single page document and used bulleting and boxing and coloring to really simplify what that language might be and scripted it even for them to make that process as simple as possible. We would create in our weekly newsletters some action steps and things that we ask that they be doing to reach out to families. So all of those things we were using in communication with our staff to help with this project all along. And that they in turn saw the buy-in, they saw families responding, they heard personal messages of success, and then they kind of took it and ran with it. So we have a couple of teams that run our attendance now bi-weekly, and it's just a formidable team. And the ways that we've reached out to families have all been mentioned here as well. We do have an app for our district that does push notifications. We have one place we can go and send out any message, and it'll go on to Twitter and Facebook and our own live feed. It'll send a push notification to families, and that has been received overwhelmingly positively. It's very short, very to the point, concise, and if it is something that requires more length in explanation or purpose as to why something needs to be done. It will direct families to that place. When they go to our website, it's all blacked out, and there's a place where families can go to get the most current updates with COVID-19, and it directs them right where we want them to go and what they would most likely be looking for. So those are pieces that we've used. In our newsletters, we have used the simplification. Bulleting is what I do. Bulleting, boxing, using a different font or different sections in the newsletter so that parents can really get to what they're looking for. I know that I'm a parent as well, and there are times I've had to skip over a message or two, and then I'll go back and say, oh wait, I know I was looking for something on attendance. It was in that newsletter, and I can find it very quickly. So that has also been the response from our families. Another piece of that, it was interesting how Todd mentioned the reading level, and that is something we see here in rural southern Maine, that is a challenge and a barrier for our families. So we have had to use very simple language. We've had to have some interpretation for different languages, interpretive services. We've even, had to have some families that will call and we'll read it to them. There are lots of things, and that's part of what our attendance team will do, is find what the barriers are with our families and then respond to it. So where Hedy was talking about the different tiers of intervention, those families who reach that tier 3 really have connected with us in a deep way, where they're coming to us and they're not afraid to come to us for support and ask for things. Like, we really don't understand the letters that you're sending us. What does this mean? Can you read it to me? And that connection is powerful. That relationship is powerful. And we've seen that now with our remote learning from home. We had, when it first began, we had them pick up packets of work. We're now in an online system, but in the beginning it was packets of work. And within 2 days, we had all 550 students' packets were picked up and or delivered to their home. So the response from the community has been phenomenal. And we're at a point now, not only where families are reaching out to us for support, but if there's someone who is confused or wondering, why haven't I heard this? Why don't I know this? Another parent will interject before we even get the chance and say, hey, have you contacted the teacher? Have you checked on the website? Have you been on the app lately? So they're kind of doing their own check and balance as a community, which is wonderful for us. So lots of ways that we've been reaching out to our staff to help our staff, and also to the school community to really make sure that that kids are here. That's what we want more than anything, is to have them here and have them learning.
Thank you, Angela, for sharing that. I was like waving my hands for you, because I think Sarah mentioned this at the top of the webinar today, but I know it's so important to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, this shared belief that parents and teachers are co-producers of good outcomes for kids. And I think in a difficult situation in a community where you might have a lot of quote unquote hard to reach families, the fact you have been able to be in touch with 100% of your families and kids really speaks to the opportunity in front of all of us. Our parents are there. They are waiting for us to figure this stuff out, to really leverage our systems to connect with them. And so we can't say we just can't find folks anymore, because we can. It's just going to take some work to get there. So I just want to really shout you out for that, and for really lifting up that value and action for all of us. And we've got some great questions that have been coming in the Q&A box. Please keep those coming. I'm going to start reading those through and going to our great panelists. Want to give a reminder to folks that Sarah is sharing some of the links to the resources that folks have been mentioning in the chat box. There will also be a compiled email with all these resources and a recording of today's webinar going out later in this week. Angela, we're getting some specific questions wanting some of the scripts and tools you're using, so I'm assuming you'd be happy to sort of share some of those so they can go back out to folks.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So Latoya is asking, I think, a question for all of the panel. You've touched on this, and maybe, Angela, you could start with this a little bit. And then, Todd, you could share a little bit about what you've been hearing and seeing. How are you connecting with parent students that have not necessarily shown up, quote unquote, in the virtual world, right, in that remote learning distance way? What are you doing to meet them where they are?
Well, like it was mentioned earlier, a lot of those families are on our high priority list already, who have chronic absenteeism or other things going on, homelessness, those types of things. So these are families that we are typically in contact with already. A lot of times our counselors are our go-to people. In these situations, we do have families where we will go to their homes, and that is our method of communication with them. Some are purely phone calls, some are purely email. It's about connecting with the family to find what works for them. And doing that, there has to be some trust established. So they have to hear from others that the school is going to do what they say they're going to do, and they're not going to cause harm in any way, that they really just want the students here and the students learning. So once they learn that, then they are kind of passing that out to others, and others are hearing it, and they're trusting the school and providing us, with that information we need. Yes, we are homeless. We've heard you can help. And our answer is absolutely, what do you need, all the time. So whether that is a weekly visit to the home or a phone call or an email or only text messaging, whatever their need is, we find a way to fill it.
Thank you. And I think a couple of our other panelists want to chime in on that. Hedy?
Thanks. So I think, Helen, that this is a time where we have to get really creative about partnerships. And both social media and partnerships, both one for older kids. You can sometimes use social media to find families, and you can use kids to find each other and figure out where other kids are. The other thing that I want to suggest is that I think we should be using churches. And like I was having a conversation with the Cleveland Browns, which is a get to school, stay in the game attendance campaign. And they're using all of the Browns apparatus, communications apparatus, because a lot of families still check out the Browns. They're going to do a whole new uniform thing. That's a sports team, your community organizations. I think we got to get creative, both about encouraging families through all these other means to reach out back to their school and to their teachers. And we should be encouraging schools and communities to work together to create lines where people can connect. And then I also wonder about people, like if a kid was in the child welfare system, maybe the social worker in the child welfare system still knows where they are, even if the teacher does not. So this is where we have to work as a whole village to find our kids and families and make sure they get the supports they need.
Great,
Helen,
thank you. So,
Helen, may I chime in on that one?
Please do.
I think I'm just going to be plussing a bunch of things that Angela and Hedy said, but then build on them. First, it sounds like Angela's school, they started this crisis with really strong family relationships. And this is what and I'm sure everyone else here has heard and seen, that schools that had strong school-family relationships were able to build on those, and they have strong, trusting, bi-directional channels of communication. But those that had trivial or no or minimal quality relationships just completely cut loose. So this is, though no one could have planned for this crisis in exactly the way it's unfolded, it has it's not the quality of family relationships seems to be I bet we will later find was like the driver of student learning in this stage. Second, that study, just to remind people, I talked briefly about a study in Washington, D.C., where we sent families actionable information and changed how they enrolled in the program. And those who, if we made the default enrollment, 95% of parents stayed enrolled. And those families, at the end of the year, having had a ton of information from the school, were more likely to want more information from the school, which is, families just are not, other than really exceptional schools like Angela's and the ones that Hedy sometimes describes, families are not used to getting useful information from their schools, so they don't make any effort to keep the school updated on valid contact. Why should they? And so it's another reason it becomes self-reinforcing to have these strong relationships. And in the service of that, when we start talking about any transition back to school in the fall, even if it's rolling shutdowns, even if its school year starts with the school closed, whatever it is, that's a fresh start to invest in the actual relationships, which will then, I know that I'm now standing on Helen and everyone's soapbox on parent engagement, but when parents think that schools are going to give them useful information, they'll be more likely to keep the contact information updated as they move around, as their situations change. They just have more reason to give the school the useful information. And finally, I talked a little bit in the chat on this. It turns out, despite digital contact information for a lot of the most vulnerable families being pretty poor, mail contact is still really strong because most official documents go through the mail. And so families keep the Postal Service updated on their contact information, and then the Postal Service forwards it. That is not the way that we're going to be able to communicate over the next 2 months or the next 18 months as a principal mode of communication. But one strategy remember, I wear my Harvard professor hat, and then I also have that Everyday Labs hat, which is a separate organization that they're working with their partner districts, is to send these mailings to these families asking for digital contact information, going old school to get the low tech to get the high tech contact info. And so we should be doing, basically, Hedy was describing contact tracing for families, trying to chase down the family. And in the absence, or maybe in parallel, we do have some ways to reach some of these families, and there's too much school left to just wash our hands of it. Sorry, that was a little didactic. Sorry, Helen.
No, that's really good, and that's actually a good segue. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, Todd, for you around the research study you mentioned in California with Hedy around the absenteeism letters, right, and changing some of the communication with that. So folks are wondering about the frequency, right? So, and the grades, how did that work in terms of how often you sent those letters, and to whom and what grades? And then if you could talk again about the impact of that too.
Sure. We so it is modeled after those home energy reports that many of you probably get, which come monthly, comparing your energy use to your neighbors. And what we started doing in Philadelphia about 7 years ago was sending these to the bottom 50% attenders, the 50% of households across K-12 who missed the most school. And we sent them back then 4 rounds in the year, throughout the year, 4 rounds of it. And we found that the majority of families reported putting them on the fridge or the kitchen counter, sharing them with others in the home. So when we look at the data, and this is one of the benefits of doing these massive replications across lots of districts, which is what we should all expect of our vendors, is getting better as a result. We learned that the effect gets bigger with each subsequent round, which is, it's not that families are habituating, it's that the second round is more effective than the first. The 6th round is more effective than the 4th or 5th. And it could be, we're trying to make sense of it, but what we've since learned is that what ends up happening is that families anticipate that they're going to get another one. And so there's this sort of sense that they're going to get feedback on how it's been going. So currently the best practice is like 5 to 7 rounds. It's consistent K through 12, which is weird. And I assume that that's why, you know, heads might shake. The reason a first grader misses school is different than the reason an 11th grader misses school. But what appears to be happening is that we're motivating parents to pay more attention to attendance. And so whether the parent is working the night shift, whether there's residential instability, whether one sibling is sick or there's an illness in the family, the parent is a little bit more likely to get the kid to go to school under all those conditions. And so whether it's 11th grade or first grade, they're more likely to push on whatever point there is to get the kid to go to school. I think that gets at, so I will post on the chat a link to the original academic article, but also to a future ed discussion of this in depth. And I'll also post a link to the organization, Everyday Labs, that actually does it now. If anybody wants to talk to them, I'm happy to link you up with them. They work with, you know, this year they administered something like 4 million or 3 million of these reports around the country.
Helen, this is Hedy. I just wanted to clarify, and I did this in the chat too. There are 2 kinds of letters we've been talking about. There's the nudge letters, which are that frequency that Todd just described, and then there are truancy notifications. The truancy notifications are prompted in California by 3 unexcused absences. That's either 3 days or 30 minutes late, actually, for kids in period attendance, so middle and high school. And what creates a truancy notification actually varies completely by state. So this was the first notice of truancy that folks got. And I think part of what is, and that's kind of a different value than the nudge letter. The truancy notification is taking what essentially is a not so helpful practice, which is to engage in sort of blaming negative behavior with or letters with families, and in some ways you get them so mad at you, they don't want to have an engagement and a partnership with you at the time when you most need a partnership around attendance, and changing that so it's a positive experience. The nudge letters were really about helping make sure that families got ongoing notification about when their kid might be missing so much school they're academically at risk.
Thank you guys for clarifying that. And thank you for offering some of those additional links and resources that'll go in the chat and then also go in the post-webinar follow-up for folks. We've got a few questions that have come in around measuring student engagement in our current climate, right? So attendance is a great sort of proxy for student engagement in normal times. And now that that measure is sort of in lots of different places during the pandemic, folks are wondering, Hedy, maybe you could start off, and then Angela and Todd, if you have thoughts, you could chime in too. What's sort of a good way to measure student engagement in our current sort of remote learning environment?
So Helen, I want to start off with saying that I think we actually need to think about different kinds of measures. So I think that we should say there's connection, or which I would equate with attendance, something taken every day. And this would be measured by knowing, you know, if you had some kind of outreach that happened, text or phone, ideal a phone call, or maybe there's some participation in some evidence of participation in some kind of virtual interaction, and you know that someone reached out and a kid responded. And if that happened one day each day, one time in some form, and you knew a kid responded, that's the equivalent of connection or attendance. And it's for the purposes of knowing, is a kid safe? Are they okay? Are we still in contact with them? Then I think there's engagement, which I would define differently. I think that's about whether kids are actually being part of activities that you're doing. Are they showing up for an entire different sorts of classes? Are they showing up in enrichment activities? Are they actually engaging in what you have to offer? And that you're going to have to gauge based on what the engagement offerings you have in a school. And then I think there's participation that might be a different term, which is, are they actually participating in the classroom work? So are they turning in assignments? Are they, whether that's remote or virtual? And then you're knowing whether they're participating. I think we're trying to put everything all in the same word when we actually are trying to measure different things. And I think that what we could be doing right now is starting with connection, making sure we're always sustaining daily connection. And I'd really be curious how Angela is thinking about this in her own school and what they've found to work.
Sure, I'll jump right on that. You make some great points there, Hedy, and that's exactly what we've been teasing out over the past month. And where we've arrived at this point, we're continuing with our attendance team. We're going to meet, or we're meeting each Tuesday, and we're having teachers use a Drive document to do their attendance, not the software that we had used previously. And they're just checking off whether or not they've made a connection with that student that day. So have they logged into Google Classroom or Seesaw? Have they seen them on Zoom? Was there an email contact with a parent or a phone call with a parent that says they're working on their paper packet, or whatever method it is that we have set up with them to access their learning? So if they've made that connection, then they're counting that child as present for attendance purposes. So our team is still going to see where those kiddos are who are not being counted as present for more than a couple days a week. So that is one method that we're using for attendance. Now, concerning the other issues with engagement and participation, we've had to very clearly define for staff that is something different. That our attendance right now is just making sure that our kids are okay, that they are safe, that they're able to access what we're putting out for them, not necessarily whether or not they are accessing it. That's kind of our next step. So once we've done our job in the attendance world of making sure a family has everything they need, then we can jump to the next level of how are you engaging with your child, or how is your child engaging in the learning? Do you need any support with that? We are a very blessed district. We are one-to-one with technology. So we can ask, are you figuring out the iPad okay? Do you have all the apps downloaded? Are you able to get in? So attendance as a first step of safety, knowing everyone has what they need, and then learning as a second part that comes after those basic needs, follows the hierarchy.
Great. Todd, anything you want to chime in about engagement, measuring engagement in this context? Oh, you're muted.
There it is. There it is. Good. Yes. This is a desperate problem. Angela, I have a question. I have a couple questions for you. So how do you, how are you consolidating the data? Like, are the teachers each in their own idiosyncratic way keeping track, and then there's some central database that they have to upload it to?
Yes.
And because there's all these different apps that monitor on their own, but every classroom, every kid has different usage and whatever.
Yep, so we are just using Google, and each classroom has their own sheet at the bottom, and we have counselors and administrative assistants who are tagged at grade level, so they're going in to check each grade level, and then they're bringing that information back to the attendance team as a liaison, and that kind of gives us that, again, those high priority kiddos that we need to be checking in with. So it's just as simple as using the Google Sheets to have every class do their own attendance, and then having people be responsible for checking grade levels.
So some person other than the teachers is dropping in and making sure that it's standardized in some way.
Yes.
Todd, I was going to just offer up that I'm hearing Google Sheets a lot, but I also want to put an interesting caveat that we heard from a district ourselves. It's because they wanted to use their attendance clerks and some of their receptionist staff to do it. And what they discovered from this is they can't go virtual. They're not very well paid paras, don't have computers at home, don't have Wi-Fi access, it's all the same challenge. And they also have kids at home too. So I do think that Google Sheets is turning out very much there, but one of the things it really raises is how are we supporting our educators, our community support staff, our after-school staff at this really incredible time, and we need them to be in contact with their families, and we also need to be supporting them.
Thank you, Hedy. Thank you all for sharing that. I think that's such an important point that everyone in this is experiencing this, right? Like our educators too. There should be a poll popping up on your screens. We've got time for a couple more questions, but feedback is really important to everyone here, and we want to know what you think about today's webinar, what you want to hear more about. So if you could, as you're taking your last few minutes with us, just be sure you complete that poll today. That it would be a tremendous, tremendous help as we try to continuously improve. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. One, Todd, for you folks, we're really intrigued by the library card example you shared and want to actually know if you have any outcomes data for that. So you talked about the big difference, 43% to 90-some%. Getting the card, did you see any changes in how kids were reading or checking out books or anything like that?
No, because it was not a study. It was just my friend Superintendent Salim and I were talking, and then the next year I pestered him to give me to give me the number the next year. So they had a theory and they had an initiative to increase and to make sure that all kindergartners had library cards. And given that objective, we were just trying to help.
Good to know. Sounds like a future dissertation for a hungry grad student. We do have another question related to one of your suggestions, Todd, about mode of communication. Somebody's saying, you know, we ask folks for a preferred method of communication. Is it text? Is it email? Is it phone? Is it paper letter? And then they try to prepare messages to fit that. Have you seen any research around sort of, because that's a recommendation that's frequently given to schools, like ask parents their preferred method and then go with it. Do you know from behavior science, does that sort of play out to be an important way to get in touch with folks and lead to better outcomes for families and kids, or is there another way we might think about?
I do not know of research on that in particular, though my intuition is we want to communicate with parents where they are and how they want to be communicated with. But that said, we also, I think, as Hedy was noting, like we also have to be careful about balancing, especially now, the demands on the teaching staff too. And even if parents think they want long emails, I am going to officially, with the like behavioral science hat on, say no one really wants long emails.
Fair enough. I'm going to, I think, ask one last question and then turn it back to Sarah to close us out. Priscilla is asking, during this pandemic, students are being assigned to virtual learning. This has been especially challenging for our special needs students and their families. And families are sort of in the role of needing to play teacher and just be way outside their comfort zone. So she is just looking for some general advice and encouragement from you all. What advice can you give to helping families during these hard and troubled times? Maybe you all could just take a minute with a couple of closing thoughts around that, and then we can close out.
I can pop into that one. I know that our students who receive special services for anything that has been a question on the table for this past month, and it hasn't left the table yet. We are just doing our best to put a schedule together for our special education staff where they can reach out to students on their caseload for their services and offer them a few minutes a day, whether it's 10 or 15 minutes a day, to support them in that need, whether it's supporting the parents in providing that. We've had some get together and create videos for different type of movement activities, especially in the physical therapy and occupational therapy world. speech sounds, all of those kinds of things. So they are really leading the way with their own ideas and ways to reach these families and provide that learning so that parents don't have to do that heavy lifting, but they're also sending the message that it's okay. You weren't trained to do this, and it's not expected that you do this. And we'll be here when your child comes back, when school resumes, we'll be here. And we'll pick right up where we left off. We'll make sure that the kiddos have what they need, and it's okay if you don't feel comfortable doing that. So it's sending the message that kind of relieves them, but it also provides them with some ways to get their child what they're looking for.
Helen,
Thank you for
I would just say that I think the issues of the kids with disabilities as one of the most challenging aspects of this work. I think there's a lot that could be done online and through virtual supports, and by really using specialized education staff that special ed staff that we aren't yet figuring out how to use. And I think this may be something that as parents think about the transition back to school, that's something to really think about. We have a little more of a window to plan on that, but helping make sure that kids have the routine of school and have both, can start to have that in school at home now, but then also later as much as they can, knowing that there are a lot of constraints on families and asking for help from their districts, but really thinking about how not just now, but when school comes back. And I would advise families to, as much as they can, find other families who are in a similar boat, to compare notes, to form a mutual support, and to also advocate for what they need from their schools and districts.
Yeah, very, very concisely. One thing that superintendent suggested to me last week that I think is a nice one, this is not about special ed in particular, is that a lot of kids are feeling anxious that this feels endless and they don't see any hope on the horizon. And I think that I think it would be useful to convey to kids that things will return at some point, and that the school is still there waiting for them. But ultimately, I just want to drive home simplifying messages. Parents are more important now in this kind of a world than ever, and communicating effectively to them. And people are very interested in what normal is. In addition to causing anxiety, not knowing it, it's also motivating to move towards what's normal, and that can be a powerful message.
Thank you. I'm going to jump back in. This is Sarah. It's hard to stop this amazing conversation, and it's really impressive to note that we've got well over 350 people that have continued the conversation even after our 90 minutes were over. I just want to say a huge thank you to our amazing presentation team today. Thank you to Todd Rogers, to Hedy Chang, to Angela Madigan for joining us and sharing your research, your work, and your perspectives. And thank you to Helen Westmoreland for moderating this amazing conversation and lifting up these really critical points about the many different ways that we need to think about how to support families throughout the months to come and the years to come moving beyond COVID-19, and how we can support staff and as well in doing this work. And to Todd for really sharing these important strategies and tactics to really make those efforts achieve the results that we want to. Really quick reminder that we'll be continuing this conversation around family engagement and productive parent-teacher partnerships in next week's webinar. I hope you can join us for that as we hear from state leaders who are thinking about birth through high school graduation, family engagement frameworks. Also, I just wanted to point out so much interest in all of the work and the resources that Attendance Works is bringing to bear to support families and engagement, and student success during COVID-19, and wanted to make sure that you all saw the link that I posted in the chat box to some of the webinars that Attendance Works has been hosting over the past few weeks. Amazing resource. I hope you can watch the recordings from those to learn from what they've been sharing. And then just want to say thank you to everybody for joining in for today's conversation. I hope you will continue to join in for more of GLR Learning Tuesdays, and I hope you will continue to be well, stay safe, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much.